A very warm welcome to you all at the King Solomon Academy. And they very kindly lent us their assembly hall. And I think that this is a very special occasion for us. I'm Nicholas Logsdale. I started Lisson Gallery in Bell Street, 1967, unbelievably, just round the corner. This is a little bit of a bigger and different first weekend talk, and it's to discuss the relationship between art and architecture, and it's a lead up to a exhibition with approximately 14 artists, which we're presenting in Venice this week for the Architectural Biennale. And essentially it's to discuss the role of art in a public context and architecture. The Venice show is entitled Genius Loci, Spirit of Place, and one of the things that always strikes me, and there's a good example of this round the corner, where an intervention by an artist, and of course an architect too, but in particular with artists, because they don't generally make buildings. And a successful artwork gives a sense of place to a location. Lisson Gallery, as experienced producer of large-scale public commissions, has supported many major public projects, both temporary and permanent, all over the world. As such, Lisson Gallery artists, especially the senior ones, have become very experienced in working with architects and development plans and commissioning bodies and cultural institutions all over the world. We have a superb panel today, and I'm going to leave it up to our host, Ekow Eshun, to introduce everybody, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and thank you everyone for being here this Saturday morning. I'm Ekow Eshun. I'm the chair of the Fourth Plinth Commissioning Group in London that selects works for the Fourth Plinth in Trafalgar Square. That role has given me a certain amount of insight into the, I think, fantastically textured relationship between art and the public realm, and some sense of the relationship between art and architecture as well. The kind of lead-off for this talk is the exhibition Genius Loci at the Lisson Gallery, which posits that public art can act as a conduit of the spirit of place, as a way to define the character of a location. That's an intriguing concept. What I'm interested in, much anything else, is that process isn't necessarily a straightforward process. The relationship between art and the public realm isn't necessarily straightforward, open, harmonious. It's complicated, it's nuanced, it's sometimes troubled, it's sometimes provocative, and it's a deeply inspiring relationship. We have a panel this morning, I think, who are eminently equipped to talk about this in detail. I'll introduce him from my right, from my far right, Greg Hilty, Curatorial Director of the Lisson Gallery. Next to him, Lewis Biggs, who's curator of this year's Folkestone Triennial, is also the founder of the Liverpool Biennial and former director of Tate Liverpool. Tamsin Dillon, curator, the former head of Art on the Underground, and currently interim head of exhibitions at Tate Liverpool. To my immediate left, Kevin Carmody, architect, partner at Carmody Groek, who are the designers of the Genius Loci exhibition in Venice, which opens in a couple of weeks' time. A week's time. Next to him, Deyan Sudjic, director of the Design Museum, and right at the end, Spencer Finch, artist. I just want to start off, actually, by asking each of you, and in fact, actually, let me go back to the beginning, Greg, by asking each of you just to talk for a couple of minutes, and no more than that, because we've got an hour, and we want to leave time also for questions from the audience. Just talk for a couple of minutes, really, about your kind of personal relationship to art in the public realm. And here, I think I said to you, not thinking about necessarily a kind of CV of I did this and that, but actually I'm just interested in why and how you might have, in fact, a relationship, affinity, and interest in art's place beyond a gallery.
I've been a curator in a museum context before joining the Lisson Gallery about 6 years ago, and have, when you said you were going to mention that, actually looking back, have been involved a lot in public projects, and they've tended to come from the gallery out. I co-curated an exhibition called Double Take at the Hayward Gallery in a long time ago, 1992, and there were two public projects that we did in collaboration with Art Angel, which had just started that year. It was the first project they did. Quite interesting. One was Juan Munoz, who was invited to make a project. He made two. One was a radio piece, so it was public art on the radio. The other was a very physical piece. He made a version of the cenotaph, Lutyens' cenotaph, out of concrete. He made bronze flags and placed it along the walkway between County Hall and the Royal Festival Hall. And it was a kind of glaring example of how an artist's vision. It was a very beautiful work, looked fantastic, absolutely central to the theme of the show, which was collective memory. But one day I went to look at it. We went to just kind of check every once in a while how it was working, and I literally saw a couple walking and bump into it. It was right in front of them. They had no reason not to see it, but they were used to going along this walk because it was a famous riverside walk, and they literally didn't expect this thing to be there, and so they collided with it. We worked with Stefan Balkenhol at the time, who placed a figure on a buoy in the Thames. Somebody jumped into the Thames to try to save the figure. So early on, I realized some of the complexities that you kind of alluded to of these issues. Working independently, I think I just want to mention a project I was involved in with Jeremy Deller. He had just won the Turner Prize and with a project with bats, and was interested in making a home for bats. And we worked very carefully with the Wetland Centre in Barnes. And eventually, rather than him doing that, he instigated an architectural competition that resulted in somebody winning the prize and that home being made. So that, I've always been interested in an artist idea, an artist concept relating to a site and bringing in exactly the dynamic of the site or the logistical problems related to that, but coming through with something that couldn't have been imagined before. And since I've joined the gallery, I've worked with many of our artists on many projects, some of which will be seen in this exhibition in Venice.
Thank you. Lewis?
Well, I started as an art historian and then as a curator for quite a lot of years. When I became director of Tate Liverpool, I had to meet politicians and developers and many people who had no interest in art whatsoever. And I realized there's a great new market there. But as a director of a museum in a city, you also have to take an interest in how cities work. So I became very interested in architecture and urbanism in particular, how people move around in cities, how people relate to cities, what the culture of a city means to people who live there and to people who visit it. And that became very important during Liverpool's year as European Capital of Culture in 2008. But meanwhile, I had, while I was still at Tate Liverpool, I had organised an exhibition called Art Transpennine, which was new commissions from artists over a 150-mile stretch from Liverpool to Hull. We organised it in collaboration with the Henry Moore Sculpture Trust and working with 40 new projects, mainly in public spaces. Was a huge challenge, and in many ways it was a huge failure, but it was also very visionary. I mean, it did start people thinking in a different way about the north of England, and 5 years later, the development agencies in the north of England invented something called the Northern Way, which was, which was a tourist initiative, but it was very closely based on the map that we had conceptualized for Art Transpennine. And I think, I mean, I know I'm not meant to go on for too long, but I think something which, as an art historian, you know, you remember that all art was public art, or was art that was site-specific or context-specific or related to a community rather than to anything else before the invention of easel painting. And easel painting and banking were developed at the same time in order to be able to circulate capital. So actually, to ask artists to go back to a position before the invention of the easel painting, it should not be a difficult thing to do. We know it's very complicated. We know putting art in public space is extremely complicated, but that is exactly what's interesting about it. And I do, as I was saying to you earlier, this is my chance to say something personal, because I expect we'll get into, into proper discussion later, but I do think that many artists are allowed to get away with murder by the market. That's to say, neither their dealers nor the public are prepared to stand up and say they're producing bad art. Dealers used to be in dialogue with artists and improve what they do in the same way as a coach improves what an athlete does. You know, you need to be in dialogue with somebody in order to make things happen. Artists very often work great as a pair, you know, the Gilbert and George scenario. They can push each other further because there is a dialogue. An artist in a studio should be in dialogue with the great issues of their day, and the good ones, of course, always are. But the bad ones are just in some solipsistic world of their own, and that shows in the bad art that comes out. If you put an artist to work with public context, with the discipline of urbanism, if you like, then it means they have to struggle a bit, and you get better art as a result.
Good, we'll come back to some of those points. Tamsin.
Well, how to follow that? I originally trained as an artist and quickly realised that whilst I wanted to continue being involved in the process of creating art, it wasn't necessarily as an artist, but also very much wanted to follow my personal desires to think about how to bring art to wide audiences beyond the gallery, whilst also thinking about the gallery itself and working with artists who might not have worked beyond the gallery in the past, and encourage them to respond to new and different contexts. So I'm not necessarily a curator who insists on working outside of the gallery. I'm interested in the overlaps and the crossovers, but I think I've worked primarily in the public realm because I'm interested in those complicated contexts that we've already heard about, and what happens when an artist presents a work to a huge audience that probably doesn't consider the idea of even going to a gallery. So those are kind of my kind of primary drivers, if you like. But as Lewis and Greg have already said, it from that point it gets incredibly complex. And I think that the point about having a dialogue is something I think we're going to come up against quite a few times in this discussion. That's something I've felt has been key to the projects that I've delivered over the last 11 years at Art on the Underground, having the chance to actually establish something and invest time in having a dialogue, in facilitating a dialogue between an artist and a very wide range of stakeholders.
Good. Let's hold it there, and we'll come back to some of that. Kevin.
Probably unusually the only architect on stage talking about how to make public space and make it engaging. Our studio has been really working at the periphery of what architects normally do, probably out of necessity, but that's allowed us to do several collaborations with artists, work with artists within galleries, but also within the public realm. But I think unusually start to think about identity and place and our responsibility to the city, to how we bring creative identity, and to what degree that should be foreground and what degree that should be background. Let's remember, not everything can be foreground in our cities. So for us, that's something very, very important, and it's led us to many collaborations, including this wonderful one with the Lisson Gallery.
Yeah.
I trained as an architect, but realised pretty early on that it was my patriotic duty never to build anything, partly from my incompetence and partly my impatience. And I was lucky enough to become a journalist and a critic, where your job is more or less to stop things happening rather than make things happen, which is what I'm doing now as the director of the Design Museum. And I must say it's fascinating to go from the side of the critic and the curator to being a client and understanding just what's involved in being an architect trying to make a building happen. My respect for them has risen hugely. I guess in my career I've always been fascinated by this tense ground between architecture, design and art. Motherhood and apple pie, collaboration seems a great thing. The world is not like that. I was, as a child, I got taken to St. Paul de Vence to see the chapel which Matisse did the glass and vestments for, and being mightily impressed, but not by the building. And a long time later, I discovered some of the story of St. Paul de Vence, which was that in post-war France, an intellectual priest couturier was very anxious about the decline into kitsch of religious art, and he set out to get Le Corbusier to make Ronchamp and one of the other projects he did. But he began with St. Paul de Vence, and he persuaded Matisse that he would do this commission. And having persuaded him to do that, he said, Monsieur Matisse, we can get any architect you like to this project for you. How about Le Corbusier? And Matisse said, I'd rather have someone who does what I tell them. And look at that building now. It's a banal building. Would Matisse's work be more powerful, more complete work of art if it was in a less banal building? Or would it be challenged by the architecture?
Spencer Finch.
I can't stop thinking about something that Lewis said about artists having their gallerists be their coach, and the idea of Nicholas telling me what to do is sort of scaring the bejesus out of me. But besides that, I also think it's incredibly difficult, and one thing that concerns me, and I guess one of the great things, one of the really wonderful things about being an artist is that you don't have to worry about the lowest common denominator. And when you do public art, often there is pressure to make the work more popular, more accessible, and I always wonder, what the cost of that is, and how do you make work that is slow and difficult and complex and exists in the public realm? It's much easier to do it in private work.
Well, let's focus on that for a moment, because the 9/11 Memorial Museum has just opened in New York. Spencer, you've got a piece in there. Can you talk about that work in particular and some of the tensions that you're hinting at when you describe the difficulty potentially of working in the public realm?
Well, that's a really obviously an unusual site, but one interesting thing about that work is that it came from a work that was done, that I did 20 years ago, that was really just a series of drawings that was shown in a gallery and then in museums. And that was a series of drawings of pink, of trying to remember the color of Jackie Kennedy's pillbox hat. So it was a sort of attempt to try to remember an image that was mediated of something that happened when I was a year old. And I also didn't even remember it correctly. I started thinking she was wearing a blue hat. and then saw an image and made the pink drawings. But it's a similar idea for what I did for the 9/11 Museum, which was almost 3,000 watercolors of trying to remember the color of the sky on that September morning. And the color of the sky, there's no way I could forget the color of that sky, but it was to sort of get it down, the sort of between memory and expression is there's this gap, which for me is really interesting, and also the really human part. The process was very complex, I think mostly because the site is so fraught and there are so many people involved. And also what was really interesting to me is this idea of abstraction and how abstraction plays out in a place like that where there are a lot of people who are still against abstraction, and that was very interesting.
To open up to the panel a little bit, I think the very interesting interface between architecture and public realm and art. Very often, the public doesn't ask for this work. Very often, the work that exists in the public arrives through a particular process. And
same with buildings.
yeah, exactly. So, what do we're involved in one way or another in commissioning some of this work and so on and so forth. What thinking about the public? What does the public get out of public art? Tamsin.
Well, I was going to... Lewis's response was something, is that obviously over the years working in various different settings, the underground, hospitals, a country park, inviting artists to respond to that context inevitably leads to a response from their audiences, and occasionally, not that often, it's been my experience that you get a response which is along the lines of, we didn't ask for this, and why weren't we consulted? And I am interested in how artists have, how you can facilitate a way for a conversation to happen between an artist and their intended audiences, and I'm interested in working with artists who are prepared to have that conversation. I think that's quite important as well. And you can give a direct kind of answer, which is, well, you didn't ask for this set of buildings or this streetscape, or that you weren't consulted in the design of this entire city. So I think I'm more interested in how to develop over a longer term, a way for a conversation with lots of different, to use that word again, stakeholders to play their part in, and to understand their responsibilities in that as well.
I mean, how do you have that kind of successful relationship? Because again, I'm interested because the art world very often speaks in this kind of utopian language about creating a dialogue, creating a relationship, and so on and so on. But actually, when it comes down to the gritty reality of people bumping into sculptures, when they're walking down the street, there's a physicality there, and I'm interested in what works as a piece of public art, as a relationship. How do we get to a place where something actually manifestly works? Who wants to take that, Deyan?
Well, I hate to nitpick about terms, but are we talking about public art or art in public? I mean, public art is a particular project which has certain aspects, and people tend to react quite badly against it sometimes. Art in public places isn't the same thing, and the relationship between art and architecture is also another thing. And I think that can be a very constructive relationship. Sometimes it can be a very negative one. Think about Richard Meyer and the Getty and the catastrophe of his non-dialogue with the artist responsible for the garden. Sometimes they can be positive ones. One thinks about the long piece in Norman Foster's Hearst building in New York, and that produces a building which has a remarkable quality which wouldn't be there otherwise. But I think it's about personal relationships between the artist and the architect, but also someone in the middle who is a broker or someone who actually can manage to make a constructive dialogue.
Lewis?
Well, yes, just to pick up on that. Genius Loci is in the United States, I think it's called placemaking, and in Asia it's called feng shui. It's how a place is from an aesthetic, historical, cultural point of view. And you need a patron or a champion who understands the place. That person can then commission an architect or an artist or a dancer or whoever to interpret the place. And if they know their stuff, they will get the right architect whose practice fits in with the energy that's already there, or an artist whose energy already fits in with what's already there. That's what I'm trying to do in Folkestone, and I think that's what Genius Loci requires if one is to respect it.
Great.
I know, and I've acted not nearly as extensively as Lewis or Tamsin, but I have acted in that role of broker, and I know what that means, and I know that one once and many times can achieve a key role in terms of working with an artist to adapt to a site. I guess it's probably my role here and also my belief that the primacy of vision with an artist is something that, not as a matter of principle, although one might have a principle that the artist should be given their head and their vision, but I think as a matter of reality to achieve success, that's the key thing. If you're trying to achieve a great public work of art, it's going to come from an artist's individual understanding of the site and appreciation of that site, and a single kind of clear vision that can then be adapted and changed and transmuted and persuaded. I mean, Spencer's project on the High Line, I don't know, and maybe you want to say, maybe you don't, how much consultation, how much discussion there was about this piece, where I think you took readings of the colour of the water along the Hudson at a certain period of time, and then translated those colours into stained glass windows in the new, at that time, High Line. And it's an incredibly, stunningly beautiful piece that really is very much about the spirit of the place. It shows the spirit of the place in a way that, literally looking at the water doesn't, or it may through, many people's engagements with that river. Of course, they have that sense, but you've somehow captured that in a single work of art. And I mean, maybe I can ask, am I right in thinking that was your approach from your practice to that context? And how much sort of tweaking or support did you have to make that a reality?
Well, I think when I did the proposal for that, because it's in a tunnel area where there's a building above it, the Chelsea Market building, that they had in mind that I would propose a light piece to illuminate the tunnel. And I saw the windows there, and I saw that as an opportunity to do something in glass, and made a proposal that was very close to what it ended up being with the windows. And so it is something that was different from what I think the panel was expecting, but at the same time was very connected to the architecture, because there were, and to what was there, not only in terms of the Hudson River, but this sort of remnant of architecture, which was 700 empty mullions of where glass had been at one point when it was used to illuminate the trains that were unloaded. So I think there was also this sense of it using the site itself in a way, the physical site as well as the more conceptual site.
I mean, Deyan, the Design Museum is in the process of opening a new space, the former Commonwealth Institute building in Kensington. Can you talk about some of the process and some of the complexities of creating a new architectural public space, a new significant public space of the type that you're building?
One of the privileges with taking a building which has an optimistic past, but which has become sad. The 1960s weren't perhaps the decade in which British architecture was good on longevity. The building actually had the characteristics of a refrigerator left in the rain. It leaks, but it's got a fantastic roof. It's a sort of English provincial collision between the Guggenheim and the Saarinen and TWA terminal. Nestling in Holland Park, what could be more astounding than that? So the job has been to bring it gently back to life, creating some of that essence of what it was. One of the words I'm most allergic to is iconic. It's straining for effect, which is the worst burden any architect can ever be given. But we've got a landmark already, and it's a question of bringing it gently back to life, creating a sense of its essence, but it'll actually be a new skin. It'll have new floors inside it. We are wrestling with public art. There is a memory of the original landscaping was done by Dame Silva Crowe, and there was this thought there will be a Commonwealth sculpture garden around it, which is something we're trying to resurrect in a gentle way by actually making the building itself something that refers to its past. We're also having the challenge of bringing with us a Paolozzi head, which Terence Conran commissioned from Paolozzi, which stands outside our existing building at Shad Thames, and we are in complex negotiations with the guardians of Holland Park about where we can put this. Dog walking comes first in parts of Holland Park.
I mean, Kevin, you talked about, amongst other things, you talked about the necessity of considering issues like identity and place when it comes to creating buildings. Can you elaborate on that?
I think I'd like to be devil's advocate, if I can, to start with. I think that what we're discussing in some parts is about contracts. The artist's contract with their own work, the architect's contract with a client, which is a very different relationship, those two, and importantly, the relationship between, I guess, the contract of the architect beyond their own client, because let's face it, our clients are important to us, but ultimately the client beyond that is the city for many years to come. And for us, there's three paradigms there, and we've had the opportunity to work with artists in the public realm, collaborating and also assisting where we're not necessarily bringing the creative identity of a project to a place. But I think those contracts are fundamentally different. I think artists primarily have to have that connection with their work before anything else. And an architect actually needs a client. And I think that's quite a different proposition.
You think that art doesn't need people looking at it?
No, and that's why I'm being devil's advocate. I think it's not about looking at. I think it's about.
You think
it's
artists
about a
don't need patrons?
of making a piece of public realm. Isn't that something that maybe needs a client?
Well, I was really interested in Spencer's. I almost heard you say you don't need dialogue when you're making art.
No, I think it has more. I mean, of course, I mean, I've made a lot of bad work in my time, and Nicholas hasn't hesitated to tell me, also, which I think it's important to hear. But I think something that Kevin brings up is this idea of when you're making work in public, it is permanent. I mean, often these projects they say the minimum span is 125 years. And how can you make work that is experimental or takes a chance, or that you don't know in advance is going to be successful? And I think some of the most successful work that artists make is work that really wasn't clearly going to be a success before it was done. And when you do an exhibition, if you do a small exhibition, it can be experimental, and if it's a disaster, it's up for a month, and then it's down, and you learn from it and move on, and no one really remembers. But if you do a public work that's bad, like the one at Union Square, who was, I'm trying to forget the work, but it's known as the smoking anus, it's with the countdown, and I mean it's horrible, and the artists. I can't remember their names, but they know that it's this hated work of art, and they kind of joke about it, and they were really trying to do something experimental and interesting on this really kind of hideous piece of architecture on Union Square South, and they, and now there's this thing that is sort of permanent and sort of there, smoking for eternity, and as an artist, that's really terrifying. And I think architects are less concerned about that. Generally my experience with architects is that it sort of comes with the territory. But I think for artists, there is a sort of joy in the impermanence of it and the sense that it can be experimental and then you can move on and try something else.
Unless you're Richard Serra.
Right.
I think returning maybe to your question, and maybe that will hopefully answer some of the issues. But we worked on a project up called the Filling Station up in King's Cross, and that's an example of where a very subtle and actually temporary solution of refurbishing a petrol station was an attempt to try and bring identity back to a place in the city, a place that had lost its emotional connection through a flux of construction over some 10 years. People didn't even know it was there. They probably didn't even know there was a canal there because there was a wall there previously, and that we had to make something that created a public space that people wanted to go to so that they could forge that emotional connection with a place again. Maybe that's an example that needed to be a bit more foreground, but I think there is an opportunity for both art and architecture to be background in more subtly informing what place is in the city.
And temporary. I mean, your catering thing on top of Westfield, it was beautifully experimental, perhaps because you knew it was going to be temporary. But I think, architects are very rarely asked to work for 125 years. I mean, the assumption with any piece of architecture is going to be knocked down in 20 years.
Yeah, we've only had briefs that long for, say, the 7 July Memorial, which needed a kind of 200-year lifespan, and it's a completely different way of thinking about architecture.
Is there a thing here between monuments and art in public places? And maybe one of the reasons that people get so distressed by what they see as bad public art is that it's trying to fulfill the role of monuments. And monuments do have a different role. And I was thinking, when you're talking, the filling station is really about lightness. It's not trying to be Nelson's column. But I think we do need the occasional monument as well. And that's maybe one of the things that modernity in architecture and art have found the hardest to deal with. We can do temporary things, we can do light things, but things that we actually believe in, which express values in some ways, are incredibly difficult. Look at the Holocaust Memorial.
But I think it's not the job of the artist or the architect to do that. It's the job of the public to do that.
To build a monument.
Exactly.
Or to memorialise.
To memorialise. The system we have in Folkestone is that it is a temporary exhibition of commissions in outside space. After the show has opened, the patron then decides whether they will become permanent or not. But the assumption starts with they are temporary. It's the public that makes things permanent. Richard Deacon has a very interesting take on public art, where that it's the art that makes the public. It's the
Can you break that down? Explain that a bit more.
Yes. If you the notion of art is that if it's good art, is that it creates dialogue, it creates conversation, it creates an atmosphere around it, which we call culture, or whatever.
Or religion, or magic.
If nobody's talking about it, it probably isn't art. If everybody hates it, it's not worth keeping. If everybody loves it.
How do you find out whether everybody hates it? And who
Time
gets to
tells
decide?
you.
Supposing they change their mind.
They do. I mean, of course, lots of great art has been lost in the past. Why not? It's the risk. It's the same risk as asking an artist to make something in the first place.
I think it's very interesting as well to commission a work and say it's temporary and then change and say, oh, well, we like this very much and it's going to, we've decided to make it permanent.
Like
That's
the
quite
Eiffel Tower.
problematic.
Or the London Eye, actually, wasn't it?
And I think, it's quite interesting to think of some examples. I think you were just briefly evoked the Richard Serra tilted art, which we may as well bring up and talk about because it's a classic kind of work that was removed because of the public and the community that made those demands around it. But it's always evoked as in all the conversations I've had about art in the public realm as whether it was nevertheless a successful work.
Well,
and now everybody wants a Serra.
The argument
in
there was
their
about who is the community. And
Yeah.
the details were rather opaque about whether it was 3 judges and 3 lawyers who hated it particularly because outside their building,
Yeah,
or,
so
was
they
it
had the
or was it
power.
the wider community?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's worth focusing. Who does have power in these relationships? Tamsin's point, because there are all sorts of different stakeholders involved in all these things. We think about the public because these things exist in the public, but actually they're almost at the end of this process. In your experience, Kevin, where does power lie?
Deyan wrote a very interesting book recently about the value, and we were just discussing it earlier, that the value of objects generally is directly proportional to how useless they are in culture. And I think as architects we'd probably agree with that. I think that actually the most valuable cultural thing that we've been involved in is a memorial, and that didn't even need to pertain to the basic tacit of architecture as shelter. Its only responsibility in the world is to resist amnesia, to stop people forgetting, and somehow that if a responsibility of something is that highly tuned, it somehow is more valuable, and I sort of agree with Deyan's sentiment on that.
Well, that's Torsten Veblen, really, the American economist who wrote The Theory of the Leisure Class, and status is affected with lack of utility, which puts art at the top of this pyramid. And you can see it, classically, if you want to buy a Rietveld chair or a Mondrian painting, the chair which Rietveld himself made with his own hands will probably be a tenth of the price of the canvas. But they're the same, one could say, the same artistic intensity and reflecting something similar. But you were talking about power, which is different. And I suppose monuments aren't always democratic. There's some very effective undemocratic monuments, and that's what they're there for. Where does power come from?
I think it can be developed. I saw my role develop as when running the art programme on the Underground. I had to be a diplomat, I had to be an educator, I had to be a friend, I had to work in lots of different ways in order to find a route to allow particularly everybody that works within the Underground, the managing director, all the way through to the people that drive the trains, to make them feel that they had a sense of ownership over something that they didn't necessarily understand. Their idea of art may well have been paintings on the wall, and but the long-term process that I was engaged with of being allowed to keep a relationship going, to develop to develop kind of different approaches, different ideas, and demonstrate how what the programme was about was reflecting artistic practice, which isn't necessarily about permanence. It's about all sorts of other things, and ephemerality is a crucial element of that, I think.
That brokerage that you did with your stakeholders, that was you, not the artist? Was the artist involved
The
with
artist,
that?
well, and what we learned very quickly was to bring the artist in at the earliest stage in those conversations. And, if the artist wasn't interested in meeting the staff, then it wasn't the right context for them to work in.
Can I ask one thing, because it's come up, and it might as well be worth focusing on, is kind of measuring public appreciation or public value. And I guess to ask Tamsin first, did you have to have public measures of...
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
And,
so how did you do that?
there's the kind of standard measures of inviting people to put comments on websites and doing surveys, face-to-face surveys, and so on. But gradually we realised that actually what became, and also measuring through the press coverage and so on. So it was easy to actually, relatively easy to provide a demonstration of what kind of response we'd had against, and measure that against the investment that the Tube had made, and how that measured up against their objectives, of course. But then what we found much more valuable was when artists wanted to make works in response to the entire context, which included the people that use the network and who work on the network. So Jeremy Deller's project, for example, with which encouraged all the drivers. We sent out very beautifully designed little books of quotes out to all the people that work on the Piccadilly line, and they could use the quotes as part of their communications with customers. It was almost an invisible project. We didn't know if it was happening. We had to find strategies of engaging with those some 5,000 staff to actually make them feel that there was something that they wanted to engage with. So it was those kinds of projects that started becoming much more important, I think.
I want to open up to questions to the audience in a couple of minutes. So if you've got questions, please get those ready. But Lewis, I want to come to a point that you made earlier on, which is that you felt that art was essentially more successful if it was made out in the public, outside a gallery. Can you unpack that a little bit more as a...
No, not necessarily more successful, but I do think artists can feel challenged to do something extraordinary for themselves by the complexities of...
So describe some of the constraints then that lead to that position. The kind of what are those constraints?
Well, the constraints are everything in life. I mean, the point about the studio is that you can protect yourself from life, as it were, and be quite inward. And again, if the artist is good, they will be struggling with something in themselves which is of interest to other people. But as soon as you move outside the studio and start trying to use the materials of the real world to make something with, and the culture that is, you know, all those indefinable bits of history and everything else that lurk in public places, then the artist has a huge job on their hands. And you know, artists who work with archives and you know, history and evidence of one kind or another, it's a huge sub-industry within the artistic world at the moment. That wouldn't exist. I mean, you know, they must be trying to get a purchase on real world through that stuff. Just because it isn't physical doesn't mean it isn't real. And so I think a lot of artists recognize themselves how important it is to have a purchase on reality in order to make something that's going to be of interest to anybody else.
I'm just concerned that feels, I know what you mean, and we'll work with it, but it's the way you put it sounds a bit absolute between the studio practice, which is unreal, and
but I was careful not. If they're good, those artists are struggling with the big issues of today, which they have personalised and brought into themselves, and we can read those issues when they bring out their wonderful studio work into the museum context. Mm-hmm. But well, I admit all that. That is great. That's fantastic. But it doesn't mean that you have to go into a museum to see good art.
Let's ask the artist on the panel. I'm interested in you make a distinction between, you know, inside and outside a gallery.
Yeah, well, I think it really depends on the artist's personality. I think there's some artists who like working in groups and others who really prefer to be alone. And I think, I mean, the collaboration on public projects, for me, has been very rewarding in some ways, and I've actually made great friends from that process, which is great, and I've learned a lot also. But I'd say generally speaking, like if in the morning I know I have the whole day absolutely alone in the studio, that's my idea of heaven. And if I know I have like 3 meetings about a public project, like a Skype meeting and then someone's coming and then a phone meeting, that's my idea of hell. So I think it's really, I think it really varies, sort of dependent on the personality of the artist. And I think there's also, what I do think is the danger is for artists who start doing more and more public work, becoming hacks. And I think that is because once you do one or two projects, at least this is the case in the United States, you people in positions in decision-making roles say, oh, he or she is able to, get it done, get the job done, and so they go back, rather than doing the hard work of trying to find artists who've never done a public project before and giving them the support they need to sort of, make a budget, for example. And so I think that for me is a sort of danger of the system of how public art often works.
I agree. I still think it's a bit more fluid. Spencer's work is, as he describes it, a very studio-based kind of practice, and yet he's highly attuned to the conditions of public space that he then presents works in or makes works from. Daniel Buren has a kind of single or a couple of clear ideas and ways that he approaches the world, but he's highly flexible in terms of dealing with stakeholders and situations and adapting them to place. Richard Deacon, we've talked about, he's in our exhibition, we're showing works, ceramic works that he's made in collaboration with a kind of master craftsman ceramicist as gallery works. He's done them purely as experimentation for his own satisfaction and the development of his practice. And yet you can see the way that work translates to the project that he's done with the architect Eric Parry in Piccadilly in an almost literally direct way. So I think it is a little bit more fluid, the idea of working within the studio and applying that through whatever kinds of mediation to a public context. It's not like there's private art and public art, is what I'm trying to.
I think that's a really good place to move on from. Because it's about choosing to work with real things. I mean, you can bring real things into the studio, but it's more rewarding than just being locked in your own head.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but at the same time, there's this joy. I mean, many artists have take this real pleasure in making. I love to make things, and in the public works, I don't make the things usually. It becomes fabricated, and often I can't even make the rendering because I don't know how to do that. And so there is this. I mean, I think so much part of being an artist is this sort of the act of making something, and that going from this idea, like in the beginning of the day when there's nothing in the studio, and then you've actually made something at the end. I mean, that's like a great day. And so that it's a much slower process, it's a much different process, and it's a much more much less hands-on process.
Okay, let's hold it there because we can carry on talking, but I want to give anyone in the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. I can see a hand up. Just going this way. Just we'll start with the gentleman at the back there, then we'll move to the front. Because, in fairness, first hand up. Yep, and then we'll move to.
Yes. Hi. My name's Sean Griffiths. I'm a director of FAT Architecture. I just wanted to ask about the title, Genius Loci, Sense of Place. There was a lot of discussion about the difference between artists working in studios or in the public realm. But what I was wondering was, can we make a sense of place in an age of globalization? I'm kind of interested, people like Norman Foster have been mentioned now. Norman Foster built in London, he built in Singapore, he built in New York. Similarly, Dan Graham, for example, from the world of art, does the same. So in this kind of globalized world, is a sense of place possible or even desirable?
Who wants to take that?
Can I give one example that's quite an old example, but for me very powerful, and it was Sol LeWitt work in a group exhibition a long time ago, sort of early 90s, around Stuttgart. It was in, I think Rudi Fuchs was the curator, and artists were given maybe a sort of 50-kilometer diameter area to work in, and Sol LeWitt, I just saw this as a visitor driving through, he made a wall, maybe 4 meters about 4 meters of breeze blocks. And then you drove a little bit further and you saw 2 walls at an angle. Then you a little bit further and it was 3, and then finally it was an enclosed space. And that came completely out of his practice as an artist, his studio practice, his ideas, kind of simplicity of his conceptual work. And Nicholas worked with him all those years ago. I don't know, he may have been involved in that project. But it actually made, first of all, it looked interesting, and it was a journey, and it then evoked other things like stages of a cross or calvaries, public projects that were sort of markers of a landscape. And I don't know, I didn't spend enough time there, I don't know whether that actual site, what its history was or how charged it was, but it's quite fascinating that as a very sort of pure conceptual project, to me it brought that place completely alive. So I think that's an example of how, as we were saying before, a studio practice and a kind of conceptual approach applied to a particular situation can give an identity and a place and a resonance and a meaning.
I think the question is why it is that so few do so much. Is it that there is not enough skill, or is it that the world we inhabit is somehow drawn to this cult of a few myths? Are we drawn to this, to celebrity, to brand recognition? Partly, I'm sure that's true. On the other hand, I'm also quite relieved that I'm always in a Boeing rather than an Aleutian or.
It probably is connected with the rise of corporate global brands. I mean, certainly, you can go to any city here, and I've noticed even in the US, and come across the same relatively small set of stores, to mention a few, obviously you've got the Gap or, all the same shops are found in every city, but how do you, and maybe the same thing is happening with the globally, the architects that are trot around the globe and create certain, their same kind of vision in different places, but maybe there's a sense that that's just what's happening in this generation, and that may have been the same. There may have been the same feeling 100 years ago that the same people were creating the same. When the
Cistercians went around Europe building the same damn church everywhere they went.
Exactly. So it's always changing and dynamic. So things will look quite different again in another century, perhaps.
Don't you look to art to, surely that's a responsibility if we're involved in art as a distinctive practice, that it has to fight against that in some way, or has to alter that. I mean, there are...
Fight against the ubiquity of those things.
So. I think that's part of what this genius lock idea is to counter that and to set against it some vision, which may be a language that's familiar, may be repeated, but I know very few, certainly work with no artists who don't give thought to the site or don't give a specificity to their interventions.
Good. It's a question from the front.
My question was slightly linked to the previous one, but we can philosophically, scientifically, anthropologically argue that place has no steadfast essence, and there's places built out of multiple experiences and different experiences for every single person, but also multiple experiences for each individual person. And so there is something quite peculiar in the act of any attempt to then try and capture something in a location at a particular time that maybe has some sense of, or any sense of permanence. And whose that might belong to. We've talked a little bit about the difference between more architectural or permanent forms of practice as opposed to more social practices. But I wonder whether ultimately any universal is always just a billowing out of the particular, to which we must always return to in order to comprehend it, and whether the issue is more on the claim that is made of the practice rather than the practice itself. And so what claims is it that we can make actually of art in the public realm, and what as an artist do you claim to be able to be doing, or as a commissioner, and with particular interest in this curatorial or titling of the particular exhibition.
It's a big subject. Who wants to take that?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
There seem to be several
Yes or
questions
no?
there. Yeah, yes or no. Maybe talking about it from an architectural point of view, and then maybe I'll hand over to the public. We're ultimately hopeful that you can make a piece of architecture, public realm, city, at the scale of room, building, city, street, in between, that has an emotional connection, yeah, that is heightening a visitor experience of that place, okay, and they're going to be multifaceted, and we could debate how you feel rather than I feel of that space or that building, but you're hopeful that it's a memorable experience, and you're hopeful that there's some connection. And I guess that's what we're seeking, isn't it? Some sort of, ultimately, architecture is an emotional experience. And it's something that you see a church spire and you think of a certain thing. That's a memory, that's an emotional connection to a place, to something you've seen. And for us, that's quite important, I think. That's the kind of fundament of how we work.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you go to Rome, and there is a collective experience which has been precipitated into the built environment, and that is legible to the visitor. That's the genius of Rome, if you like, is that you can read history in the urban experience, and so everybody becomes a part of that experience. It's a shared thing, and that's possible everywhere. It's just it needs time and skilled people to be able to unravel and make visible what the history of a particular place is. You're talking as if history is something which you invent on the spur of the moment in your individual experience. That's aesthetics. That's great. We need that. But history is actually not yours. It's there before you arrive there, and it's something which either you can understand or you don't understand, with the help of architects and urbanists and artists.
Okay, look, we've got time for one last question, if anyone else has hand up in the row behind.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about maybe your reflections on negative reactions from the public. I mean, I feel like within architecture, there are sort of ways to react negatively to a building if it doesn't work, if you can't really inhabit it, and then also on the side of whether you just don't like it or aesthetically it's not pleasing. With art and the public art, it's not meant to have sort of a used to be inhabited in many cases. You mentioned, Spencer, the negative reaction to the Union Square piece, because the piece is terrible, but then also maybe there's sort of a possibility that a negative reaction to a piece sort of raises up consciousness about some sort of ideology that's present and maybe needs sort of focus. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about that.
Who wants to take that? Spencer?
Well, I've made work that people don't like. And I think, I guess it just goes back to what I said earlier, is that I think one of the great things about being an artist is the audience is small, and you don't have to be popular, and you don't have to make work that has the lowest common denominator, and that there are people, and that doesn't mean that it's art that's made for an elite. For me, it's art that's made for people who share the spirit of it, and if that's a very small number, but the experience that they have is a deeper experience than they have in watching, say, something that's very popular. And, I may be, deluding myself, but that's sort of my belief. My favorite viewer is this guy named Bill Olson, who I met almost 20 years ago, who helped me with the project making. He's a antenna maker and a square dance caller in Maine. Those are his two jobs, and he really doesn't know anything about art, but he helped me make an antenna for a project I was doing once. But he comes to my shows now and then when I have an exhibition in New York, and he And he like gets it. So we walk around and I tell him what this is, and he gets really excited about it. And because he's a square dance scholar, he stamps his foot in like rhythm. And, you know, a handful of experiences of that where you have this connection with people who live very different lives from yourself and have a powerful experience. For me, that makes up for all of the people who walk by something or don't like it or just aren't interested. And I think we can't expect everyone to be interested, but we can hope for there to be a really deep connection with some people. So that's sort of how I...
Great. I guess one very obvious case to mention as almost a deliberate, not provocation, is the Orbit, Kapoor and Cecil Balman's work in the Olympic Park, and it's had, let's say, mixed reaction. There's been very negative press, there's been very good press, very good and negative public reactions. It'll be interesting to see now that it's fully open to a wider public, what people think when they can actually go up and kind of experience the work, as it was made to be experienced rather than just to be seen from a distance. But, Anish Kapoor is quite relaxed and not in a complacent way, but he expects negativity, he expects challenge. It was challenging him and Cecil Balman to even make the thing or to design it. It's a kind of feat of engineering. And he knows very well how to make beautiful, crowd-pleasing works, but he felt that he owed it to London, he owed it to that situation to do something that was challenging and kind of bracing. And so
there was an
that's what you got
architect involved too, Catherine Finlay, sadly.
Exactly, Catherine Finlay, yes.
Yeah, I think the idea that popularity comes into the equation anywhere is pernicious. I mean, it's not. Art should never be about popularity. I mean, an example from my own life on that was that I commissioned probably one of the most successful things I ever commissioned was for Liverpool Biennial, and it created a huge negative storm about it, and it took place on council property, of course. So the leader of the council had to make a decision as to whether to go with his electorate, as it were, and tell me to take it away, or whether to support me and the artist. And he said, "We'll make a deal, Lewis. You can keep it there, but it's your fault." And I was completely happy with that. I had death threats in the post and all the rest of it, but that's the price of putting interesting art in the public realm. And he got it. He was the champion of that project. He understood how important it was for the city to have that extremely unpopular piece of artwork hosted by the city for 10 weeks. And that's really, really important.
Lewis, have you ever speculated why, well, I'm sure you drive down Park Lane every so often, have you speculated why there isn't a storm of protest about the horse that's trying to dig its way down to New Zealand? Westminster, as you know, has rather curious policy towards public art, but no one seems to have noticed.
Look, there are a lot, aren't there? There are a lot like that.
Yeah. And they all come from one place.
Yeah, it's a question that we may have to leave unanswered because I think we've reached the end of our time this morning. And I think we've managed to talk in some detail about some of the risks and the rewards, some of the life and death issues, in fact, of art in the public realm. I want to thank our panel for today, Greg Hilty, Lewis Biggs, Tamsin Dillon, Kevin Carmody, Deyan Sudjic, and Spencer Finch. And I want to thank all of you for coming here this morning and also to Lisson Gallery for their show, Genius Loci. Thank you very much. Thank you.